Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. That was the incomparable Uncle Moshe singing Torah Siva Lanu Moshe Morasha Kehilas Yaakov. As we'll see, that's going to come up in today's page from the Talmud. And that is the first lesson, the first Torah lesson we teach our children. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we get together to do some beautiful learning midweek on a Wednesday? Melissa in Great Neck, Yehudit in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Stephen in Oklahoma, Christo in Lubbock, Pauline in Chicago, Nancy in North Carolina, Allison in North Carolina, Bill in Missouri. Bell says, Ora Torah, parading with our little Torahs at the synagogue. Paula in Chicago, John in Sedona, Paul in the Great Northwest, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Hannah in New York, Carol in Cleveland, Bella says Shalom, Terry in Minnesota, David in Notre Dame. John, to answer the question, I don't think that the first lesson we teach our children is the first commandment given in the Torah, to be fruitful and multiply. Very funny. James in Indianapolis, Guy in Dayton, Ohio, PK in Colorado, Paula says hello, Rose in New Mexico, Julie wishing us peace and many blessings. Leslie says, oh my, this is my lucky night. Great to have you, Leslie. Cheryl in Princeton, Illinois, over there on the YouTube side. Seraphim in Sacramento. Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, everybody. A quick thought I'll share. I'd heard this before, but not expressed quite this way. So on Friday nights, when we have Shabbos dinner, we're going to make a kiddush over wine normally, and we're going to make a blessing. We're going to recite a blessing called the motzi over the challah, over the bread that we eat, the challah bread, on Friday nights, right? So first we sanctify the day by making kiddush over the wine. Then we wash our hands and we say a blessing over being commanded to wash our hands. And then we don't speak until we eat bread, except for the leader of the dinner, as it were, who's going to recite the blessing over the bread. Now, many homes have the tradition that before reciting the blessing over the bread, which is covered, we'll actually uncover the bread a little bit, take the challah knife and make a little cut in the bread. You don't cut off a piece, but just make a little cut, then cover it back up and recite the blessing. And somebody asked, well, why do you make that little cut in the bread? Two reasons are given. One is that after we make a blessing over the bread, we should eat bread right away. However, because it's Friday night, we are going to say the blessing over a whole loaf of bread and not over pieces of bread, right? We've learned that before, that on Friday night you should have, for Shabbos, in fact, you should have 2 loaves of bread. They can be small, but they should be whole loaves. So since you're not going to recite a blessing and then the prayer leader is going to take a bite out of that bread, he's going to cut it up. The normal thing is, not everybody, but the normal thing for most people is to use a knife and cut slices and then to distribute those around the table. So by making that cut, even before you say the blessing, it's like you're shortening that interruption between saying the blessing and actually eating, which is that time that it takes to, cut up the loaf so that people will have their pieces. Right? And so in this way, we shorten that interruption between the blessing and the eating. That's one reason. The other reason that's given is a more Kabbalistic, mystical reason. And this is pretty cool. And this is one I had not heard before. Why do we make that cut in the bread? It is to write God's name on the bread. In what way? So the most powerful name of God is the 4-letter name of God, which we don't even pronounce, but is written in the Torah many, many times. And so it is spelled Yud, He, Vav, He, the 4-letter name of God. So you're going to be holding the bread in your hands. Even if you're holding the challah board, you're still holding the bread with your hands. And so you have two hands, each with 5 fingers, and those represent the 2 heys in God's name. The hey is the 5th letter of the alphabet, has the numerical value of 5. So hey and hey. The bread between your hands is represented by the vav, the simplest, straight letter. And that means that you're missing one letter for God's name, and that is the smallest letter, the yud, right? And so the yud, which is the beginning of the name, the humblest letter, and no accident that the humblest letter begins God's name, is then represented by making that little cut in the bread. The simple little line is the yud. Then your 2 hands are the heys, and the bread itself is the vav, and that way you have all 4 letters of God's name. And you are acknowledging that this bread, which represents all the blessings which come to us from God's blessing, that it is coming from God. And so we're kind of inscribing that thought even as we're partaking of the bread on Friday night. It is Elul. Let's have a shofar blast for anyone who may not have heard the shofar today. All right. There we go. And let's get into it. Where are we holding? Today we are completing chapter 3. We're on page 42 here in Tractate Sukkah, the 7th volume of the Talmud. This volume has, these are the laws of Sukkot. This volume has 5 chapters. Today we're completing chapter 3 and opening chapter 4. So let's get right to it. We begin actually at near the bottom of the B side of page 41. The Mishna says, Rabbi Yosei says, so in the Mishnah that we've been learning, which was Mishnah number 12 here in chapter 3, Rabbi Yosei says that if the first day of the festival, meaning Sukkot, occurs on Shabbos, and one forgot and carried the lulav out into the public domain, he is exempt from liability to bring a sin offering. Now, the lulav and esrog, and when we say the lulav and esrog, we mean you would take all 4 species, the branch of the date palm, a willow branch, a myrtle branch, and the fruit together. And it is a commandment to take the 4 species, meaning to lift it up in your hands. It's a Torah commandment on the first day of the festival. It is a rabbinic ordinance to do it on every day of the festival, but after the first day, it's by rabbinic ordinance rather than a Torah law. So what happens if the first day is Shabbat? Now, as we're going to see, we're going to be talking more about this, what happens as Shabbat intersects with Sukkot. And there's going to be a difference in the way this was done when the temple was standing and after the temple was destroyed. These days, we do not take the lulav and say the blessing over taking the lulav and esrog on Shabbos. And we'll talk more about why later. But this is now talking about the way it was done when the temple was standing. So they wouldn't carry the lulav and esrog on Shabbos. But what they would do is on Friday afternoon, they would take the lulav and esrog to the synagogue so it would be there. And likewise, they would do this on the Temple Mount so that it would be there. And then on Shabbos, they just walk themselves either to their synagogue or if they're in Jerusalem to the Temple Mount. And their lulav and esrog is waiting for them there. And then they lift it and say the blessing at the synagogue or at the Temple Mount. That is not the way we do it today. Okay, so the sages taught, so in the case that somebody forgot that it was Shabbos and he carried the lulav and esrog out of his house, in the Mishnah we learned that he shouldn't do that, but if he did do that, he's going to be exempt from bringing a sin offering which he would normally be liable to bring because he violated the prohibition on doing work on Shabbos, and specifically the prohibition on carrying objects in the public domain on Shabbos. So he violated that law by carrying the lulav and esrog on Shabbos. However, he's going to be exempt from bringing the sin offering because he was engaged in the mitzvah of lulav and esrog. But there's a but. We have to understand what the however is in this case. The sages taught that this person is exempt only in a case where he did not yet fulfill his obligation. In other words, when you pick up the lulav and esrog, now that's what you have then fulfilled your obligation. You have to pick it up. The 4 species, you have to pick it up on Sukkot. You're also supposed to say a blessing over doing that, but the fact is, as soon as you pick it up, you have done what the Torah commanded you to do, which was to pick it up on Sukkot, on the first day of the festival. So the sages are saying that if he picked it up and then continued walking with it out of his house, well, he's in the midst of fulfilling that obligation. But if while he was in his house, he picked it up and then he put it down and then he picked it up to carry it outside of his house, now he's not fulfilling his obligation anymore. He already did that. So it's just going to count as nothing more than violating Shabbos by carrying it out of his house into the public domain, and he will not be exempt from bringing the sin offering. Again, this is how the law stood while the temple was standing. The Gemara asks, is it possible to carry the lulav without fulfilling one's obligation? Didn't he, from the moment that he lifted it, fulfill his obligation with it? And Abaye said, well, it is referring to a case where he overturned it and lifted it. One fulfills his obligation only when lifting it in the manner in which it grows. So it's possible that he picked it up and walked out of his house with it and hasn't yet fulfilled his obligation, even though he picked it up. How would that be possible? If he picked it up in the manner which is not the way we pick it up in order to fulfill our obligation. How do we do it to fulfill our obligation? So the branch of the date palm is straight up in the middle. The willow, the myrtle branch, they're also right side up. And when you are doing it to fulfill the obligation, the citron, the esrog, that yellow fruit, also has to be right side up. If any of them are upside down, so then you're not fulfilling the mitzvah properly. So if you just picked it up in order to carry it, and you did this on purpose so that you wouldn't fulfill your obligation until you were, in a public place or with your friends or wherever you wanted to fulfill the obligation, you were just carrying it there. So then you haven't fulfilled your obligation of taking the lulav yet on Shabbos. And if you were carrying on Shabbos, then for sure you're guilty of violating the prohibition on carrying on Shabbos. Rava said, even if you say that it is referring to a case where he did not invert one of the branches or the esrog, with what are we dealing here? It is a case where he took the lulav out in a vessel and he did not fulfill his obligation. In fact, these days in Jewish neighborhoods during Sukkot, you often see people carrying their lulav and esrog in a container. It's kind of like a long plastic, transparent container. Some people have a bag or something. And really what they're doing with that is protecting the branches, and there's usually a box for the esrog, to get it to synagogue or wherever they're going without it being harmed. So clearly, when you're carrying it in a vessel, you're not doing so for the purpose of taking the lulav and fulfilling your obligation that day. You're merely transporting it to the place where you intend to fulfill your obligation. And then the Gemara asks, but isn't Rava the one who said that taking by means of another object is considered taking? Like if you actually lift it, but you use some other object to help you in the lift, that still is considered taking. So even though you have this vessel, this container that the lulav is contained in, haven't you actually taken the lulav? Haven't you fulfilled your obligation, even though it's in a vessel? And the Gemara answers, this applies only when this additional object that you're using to lift the object needed for the mitzvah is done in a deferential manner for wrapping or ornamentation. But if the addition is in a degrading manner, meaning like if you wanted to, take the lulav and esrog in order to say the blessing, you wouldn't do that in its container. That would be degrading to the mitzvah because it's just a transportation type of vessel. and so you haven't fulfilled your obligation yet. Rav Huna said that Rabbi Yosei would say, in the case of a bird sacrificed as a burnt offering that is found among other birds in one of the corners of the altar when the temple is standing, and the priest thought that it was a bird sacrificed as a sin offering, and priests would eat parts of sin offerings, and so the priest ate this bird that was, it was burnt as a sin offering in the temple. He is exempt from liability to bring the special offering for misuse of consecrated items because he thought he was fulfilling his obligation, right? He thought that he was eating the part of the sin offering that is eaten by priests. He ate the wrong animal. It wasn't a sin offering. It wasn't set aside for him. He made a mistake, but his intention was good. And in that case, he's not going to be liable to bring that special, a different offering, which is brought by people who misuse consecrated property. So what is Rav Huna teaching us here? Is it that if one made an error in the matter of a mitzvah, he is exempt? But this is an identical statement to that which Rabbi Yosei said. What novel element is introduced by Rav Huna? Rabbi Yosei said, right, if you took the lulav and esrog, meaning to transport it, but you picked it up itself and walked out on Shabbos with it, you're not going to be liable to bring the sin offering. How is that different than what Rav Huna is now saying, that if a priest ate the wrong bird, he's not going to be liable to bring an offering for it? And the Gemara answers, the difference is, lest you say that it is only there in the case of carrying the lulav, that the one who made an error in the matter of in trying to do a mitzvah, he's exempt, and it's because when he picked up the lulav and esrog, he is performing a mitzvah. He is fulfilling an obligation, even though he shouldn't have walked with it on Shabbos out of his house. He has taken it up, and he is now performing the mitzvah. The priest who ate that bird mistakenly, that one he wasn't supposed to eat, he isn't performing a mitzvah when he eats that bird. His commandment is to eat the bird brought as a sin offering, not to eat this other bird that was brought as something else. So he hasn't fulfilled any obligation when he eats it. He just made a mistake. And you might think, well, the guy in the lulav is exempt from bringing a sin offering, but the priest isn't exempt because he didn't fulfill any obligation when he ate the erroneous bird. Nevertheless, Rav Huna is teaching us that he also is going to be excused from that particular offering. What is the law on this? Making an error in the course of performing a mitzvah. If one inadvertently carries a lulav out from a private domain on the first day of Sukkot that coincides with Shabbos during the temple era, or if one carries it 4 cubits in the public domain, or if he unwittingly commits any transgression in the course of performing a mitzvah, he is exempt from the obligation to bring a sin offering. However, this is specifically in a case where he committed the transgression before he fulfilled his obligation. If he unwittingly commits the transgression after he already fulfilled the obligation, right? If he already picked up the lulav and esrog in his house and put it down, so he already fulfilled his obligation on the first day of Sukkot, and then he picks it up again and walks out of the house, now he is going to be liable to bring the sin offering. This is the ruling of Maimonides in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei. However, most halachic authorities disagree and rule in accordance with the opinion of the sages who hold that even one who commits an unwitting transgression in the course of performing a mitzvah is liable to bring a sin offering. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 12. Here is Mishnah 13, the final Mishnah of chapter 3. A woman may receive a lulav from her son or from her husband and return it on Shabbos to the water in which it had been placed. Rabbi Yehuda says on Shabbos one may return the lulav to the water, and on festival one may even add fresh water to the vessel so that the lulav will not wilt. And during the intermediate days of the festival, when it's neither the first day of the festival nor Shabbos, One may even change the water, right? Take out the old water and put in fresh water. And this idea is these are branches, right, from a tree, the branch of a date palm, branch of willow tree, branch of a myrtle. And if you keep them moist, they're going to last longer, right? They're not going to wilt. And there's lots of little tricks for keeping them moist during Sukkot. I like to wrap them in a moist towel and then tin foil around that. But you have to be careful that you don't overdo the wetness, or then the leaves can start to get moldy. But at any rate, one thing like you don't do is put, for example, cut flowers into water during Shabbos. You wouldn't do that. Here, you wouldn't put it into water for the first time, but what we're being told is that if it was already in water, this son or this husband could give it to the woman of the house, and she could put it back into the water in which it was stored to keep it fresh. And a minor who knows how to wave the lulav is obligated in the mitzvah of lulav due to the requirement to train him in the performance of mitzvahs. Right? A minor is not obligated in the commandments. He only becomes obligated when he's a legal adult, after he has his bar mitzvah. Nevertheless, he is obligated to wave the lulav, not because he's obligated to wave the lulav, but rather because he's being trained to perform the mitzvahs properly when he becomes of age. And that's why we obligate the father to teach the son how to wave the lulav. The Gemara. With regard to the halacha, the law, in the Mishna, that a woman may receive the lulav, the Gemara asks, well, that is obvious. Why would it be prohibited? And the Gemara answers that it is necessary to state this, lest you say, since a woman is not subject to the obligation of the 4 species, because this is a time-bound positive commandment, you might say that she should not receive the lulav, as for her, moving the lulav on Shabbos is tantamount to moving something which is muktzah, something that is set aside, right? Just as a hammer has no use, no proper use on Shabbos because it's a tool with which we do work, and so we don't even touch the hammer during Shabbos. That's called muktzah. We studied that a lot when we in Tractate Shabbos and also in Tractate Eruvin. So you might think that somebody who's not obligated in waving the lulav shouldn't touch the lulav at all. That would be the case with the woman. You might think that that's the case with a woman. She shouldn't touch the lulav at all, since for her it's muktzah and she's not obligated. But what we're learning is that it is, and it would therefore be prohibited. Therefore, the Mishna is teaching us that it is permitted, that you can give it to the woman, she can touch the lulav on Shabbos. It is taught in the Mishnah, a minor who knows how to wave the lulav is obligated in the mitzvah of lulav. And the sages taught a minor who knows how to wave the lulav is obligated in the mitzvah of lulav. One who knows how to wrap himself in a garment is obligated in the mitzvah of tzitzis, ritual fringes. If the child knows how to preserve the sanctity of tefillin by keeping it in a state of cleanliness, then his father buys him tefillin. If he knows how to speak, his father immediately teaches him Torah and Shema. And the Gemara asks, and in this context, what is the Torah taught to a child who has just learned to speak? Right? As soon as a child learns how to speak, as soon as a Jewish child learns how to speak, as soon as he can say mama, papa, the first word, he knows how to speak, we start teaching him. What do we teach him? We teach him Torah. And Rav Hamnuna said it is referring to the verse, Torah tziva lanu Moshe morasha kehilas Yaakov. The Torah that Moses commanded us is an inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. And that was the kind of charming children's song that I played at the top of the show during the countdown. Very famous song, like anyone who's ever been to Hebrew school or to synagogue has probably heard it. That version was by the famous, sort of kids singer Uncle Moishi. But Torah tziva lanu Moshe morasha kehilas Yaakov. The Torah that Moses commanded us is an inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. In other words, from the moment that a child can speak, you're telling him that we have a Torah, that it is something that is commanded to us, right? The Torah contains commandments, mitzvos. We are obligated in these commandments, and those obligations in the Torah are a treasure for us. The fact that we are commanded, the fact that we have to make all these sacrifices and that we have to learn in order to do these commandments properly, all of that is a treasure for us because it brings us nearer to our Father in heaven. And the Gemara asks further, and what is Shema that is taught to a child who has just learned to speak? And of course, that is the first line of the Shema, which now in teaching mode I'll say, and therefore includes God's name. And you would teach the child to say, and we teach them at night as they're going to sleep. We recite it with them. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. And you might notice that I paused between the words. When you say the Shema, you shouldn't slur one word into the next. There needs to be a tiny pause, a tiny silence between each of the words. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. That's the most fundamental tenet of Judaism. And so we start to teach that to the kids as soon as they can speak. The sages, so then I continue, skip a couple paragraphs, and at the end of chapter 3, we learn, if the child is one who is able to eat an olive bulk of grain, one distances himself 4 cubits from his poop and from his urine before praying or reciting the Shema, as the poop or the urine of a child of that stage of development produce offensive odors like those of an adult. In other words, when the child is still nursing, he's just in full baby mode, right? And like, you don't have to distance yourself from the child's diapers or whatever. You could be in a room. It would be okay if the child is in diapers. But as soon as the child starts eating solid food, so then his bodily excretions are going to produce foul odors. And then we treat, those substances the same way we would of an adult. You don't pray. You don't say any prayers or blessings in the presence of those bodily excretions. And that's why you don't pray in a bathroom. That's why you don't take your tefillin or your tzitzis into a bathroom. You separate those things, right? You separate those things from each other. Okay. And then they also specify how long it takes the child to eat that solid food, but that's a technicality we don't have to get into. We also learn about children. If the child is one who is able to eat an olive bulk, like the volume of 1 olive, of roasted meat, right? So a baby can't eat roasted meat, but when the child is old enough to actually eat a piece of roasted meat, at that point, he can be included as one of the individuals who are registered to eat the Pesach, the Paschal lamb. We no longer bring the Paschal lamb as an offering, not since the temple was destroyed. But when the temple is standing, people have to arrange in advance to share the Passover lamb on Passover night. And then that it is brought to Jerusalem, right? It can only be slaughtered in the temple compound. Then you take it out of the temple compound and go to your little picnic area, wherever you and that group of people who have registered to participate in that Passover lamb, that particular one. And from when the child can eat meat, he can be included in the group that is registered to that particular Passover lamb. And as it is stated, according to every man's eating, you shall make your count for the lamb. Exodus 12:4. And Rabbi Yehuda says, ability to consume an olive bulk is insufficient to include him in the group. Rather, he is not included until he is able to discern what he is eating. How is that determined? If one gives him a pebble and he throws it away, and if one gives him a nut and he takes it, then he is a kid who can distinguish between, a pebble and food, and so then he can be included in the group registered to the Passover lamb. He's somebody who knows what he is eating. That concludes chapter 3. Today's actually going to be a short class. I'm just going to share with you the Mishna, the first Mishna of chapter 4. and then we'll continue with the discussion of that Mishnah tomorrow. This is near the end of page 42 on the B side. Mishnah number 1 of chapter 4. The lulav is taken, and this is actually a somewhat lengthy Mishnah. The lulav is taken, and the altar is encircled together with the willow branch, either 6 or 7 days, depending on which day of the festival occurs on Shabbos. The obligation to recite the full Hallel and the commandment of rejoicing, i.e. eating the meat of the peace offering, is in effect for 8 days. The 7 days of Sukkot, and then the 8th day, which is its own holiday called Shmini Atzeret. On all those 8 days, we have the commandment to rejoice and to recite the Hallel, the special prayers that we say on festivals, and we say it on all 8 days. The commandment of Sukkah and the ritual of the water libation on the altar in the temple are in effect for 7 days, not on Shmini Atzeret. The flute is played in the temple for 5 or 6 days, depending on which day of the festival occurs on Shabbat to enhance the rejoicing of the festival. Now, this chapter 4 is going to have a lot to say about how Sukkot was celebrated when the temple was standing and how it started to be celebrated after the temple was destroyed. Yesterday we had a question about the Hoshanas, right? So during Sukkot, and for thousands of years, ever since the temple was destroyed, what do we do during the 7 days of the holiday? In the synagogues, we do these things called the Hoshanas, right? Where we actually take our lulav and esrog and we walk around the room. There's an open Torah scroll in the middle, and we do these circuits of the room while holding the lulav and esrog. And I think it was Sharon who asked yesterday, when did that develop? It definitely developed after the temple was destroyed as a commemoration of what was happening when the temple stood. When the temple stood, they would do a ceremony in the temple with the willow branch. And they would put these willow branches around the altar, and the priests would walk around the altar once saying, "Please God, deliver us. Please God, grant us success." That they did when the temple was standing. On the 7th day of Sukkot, they would circle the altar 7 times, and that's called Hoshana Rabbah. It's still called Hoshana Rabbah. The 7th day of Sukkot is Hoshana Rabbah. That is the day when the days of awe really end, right? So on Rosh Hashanah we are all judged. On Yom Kippur, that judgment is sealed, but there's a little bit of wiggle room through all the days of Sukkot to make an atonement for our sins of the previous year and set ourselves up for the coming year. But that judgment is totally finalized on Hoshana Rabbah, the 7th day of Sukkot. And that's also the day when we say a lot of prayers for rain in the coming year, this coming rainy season in the Holy Land is coming at winter. On Hoshana Rabbah, the 7th day of Sukkot, there's special prayers for rain to come. So once the temple was destroyed, then the rabbis instituted that they would make these circuits around the room to recall how the priests circled the altar when the temple was standing. And then on the 7th day, we recite a whole bunch more of liturgy as we circle the room. And then we also have the ceremony of the willow branches. We circle with the whole 4 species, but then there's a special ceremony of the willow branches on the 7th day. More about that to come. Back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah explains that the lulav is taken for 7 days. How so? If the first day of the festival occurs on Shabbos, since the mitzvah to take the lulav is a Torah mitzvah, it's going to override Shabbos, right? When the temple was standing, we would take the lulav on Shabbos if Shabbos coincided with the first day of the festival. But if the first day of Sukkot is not on Shabbos, then Shabbos is going to land sometime during that week. At that point, taking the lulav and esrog was by rabbinic ordinance, not by Torah law, and so it would not override the restrictions of Shabbos. Therefore, when the temple was standing, the lulav and esrog would be taken on 7 days if Shabbos fell on the first day of Sukkot, but only on 6 days on every other year when Shabbos wasn't the first day of Sukkot. I just explained that. And the altar is encircled with the willow branch for 7 days. How so? Right, the altar. So when the temple is standing, if the 7th day of the mitzvah of the willow branch, that's Hoshana Rabbah, occurs on Shabbos, since on that day it is a mitzvah by Torah law, it overrides Shabbos, and the commandment of the willow branch is performed all 7 days. And if the 7th day occurs on one of the rest days of the week, and one of the other days of the festival coincides with Shabbos, since the mitzvah of the willow branch is then by rabbinic law and consequently does not override Shabbos, it is only performed on 6 days. That's when the temple was standing, and it was done with willow branches around the altar. Right? Once the temple was destroyed, we don't do the willow branches specifically except on the 7th day, but circling the room is sort of commemorating how it was done with the willow branches when the temple stood, but instead of the willow branches on all the other days, we do it with the 4 species, right? The date palm, the myrtle, and the willow, as well as the esrog. How is the commandment of lulav fulfilled in the temple when the first day of the festival occurs on Shabbos? If the first day of the festival occurs on Shabbos, all the people bring their lulavim to the Temple Mount on Friday, and the attendants receive the lulavim from them and arrange them on a bench, while the elders place their lulavim in a special chamber. They were given permission to do so due to the concern that they would be injured the following morning in the rush of people who are in search of their lulavim. I mean, imagine when thousands of people are at the temple and it's Shabbos, so they all brought their lulavim the day before. Now they get to temple early in the morning, to the temple, the holy temple, and they want to, take their own lulav, and there's just like this mob of people trying to get their lulavs, and people would get hurt. They would literally get hurt. And the court teaches the people to say, with regard to anyone whom my lulav reaches his possession, it's his as a gift. And they instituted this to avoid the likely situation where people would inadvertently take lulavim that did not belong to them, as on the first day of the festival, one does not fulfill his obligation with a lulav that does not belong to him. And so for all the people that would go to the temple when the temple was standing, so they would say to them, okay, well, declare that if you don't get your own lulav back, it's no longer yours, it's ownerless, and whoever picks it up, it belongs to him. And that way, everybody who's holding a lulav on that first day of the festival at the temple, when the temple was standing, it would be his lulav, right? He would be the owner of that lulav, and therefore he could appropriately fulfill his obligation. And finally, the next day, everyone rises early and comes to the temple, and the attendants throw the lulavim before them. And in the confusion, the people snatch the lulavim, and in the process, they strike one another. And when the court saw that they came to potential danger, they instituted that each and every person will take his lulav in his house and fulfill the mitzvah there. So they actually ended the practice of bringing the lulavim to the holy temple because it was just too much of a balagan. That's an Israeli word for a mess. It was too much of a mess. And so they said, you know what? You're going to do it on Shabbos. If Shabbos is the first day of the festival, but you're going to do it at home. And that's the way it came to be done during the temple period. Eventually, the temple is destroyed. The sages will do away with the practice of taking the lulav during Shabbos, even if it falls on the first day of the festival. And we're going to learn more about that. It's very interesting because it actually has to do with the connection between the Babylonian Jewish community, where Torah continued to flourish, and their connection to the Jewish community in the Holy Land, where actually, Torah learning and observance died down because of the heavy hand of the Roman persecution. More to come on that tomorrow and following days. Okay. Let me see if we have any questions. Okay. Sharon has a comment. I love that the parameters for teaching are based on the skills a child has and not by a set age, an enlightened approach to education. Agreed, right? As we saw, the sages dictated from when do we teach the kids certain, certain lessons, certain skills, from when they're ready, not when they reach some arbitrary age. Right, so the willow branches, the little bunches of willow that we use, we do that on Hoshana Rabbah. We'll be talking more about that, but like we have the Hoshanas, the circling the room, and basically praising God while we are holding the lulav and esrog on all the days of Sukkot. Then on Hoshana Rabbah, the seventh day of Sukkot, we have many more circuits of the room while we're doing that, and a lot of singing, at least in certain congregations. And then at the end of all of that, they hand out these new bunches, not the 4 species, but rather these bunches of willow branches. We recite certain things with them, and then we beat them on the ground. And that really is kind of the conclusion of the days of awe. I mean, we still have the rest of that day when we're eating in the Sukkah. The next day, Shmini Atzeret, is another holiday when we don't eat in the Sukkah anymore. At least not a qualified Sukkah. People will take the roof off. There's different traditions about that. But this beating of the willows on the ground is a special feature of Hoshana Rabbah, and we'll talk more about that later. That's what I've got for us today. May you be blessed to witness and acknowledge the blessings of God all around us all the time. It's a good thing to just remind yourself from time to time. And the more often you find yourself saying, thank you, God, the better. Have a great night.